I woke up to find my entire property under siege. Not by vandals, not by thieves, but by my very own HOA. They built 28 condos on my land, without my permission. Every letter, every fine, every friendly reminder felt like a calculated attack designed to push me to the edge. I couldn't believe how far they were willing to go, until I realized I wasn't defenseless. I own a demolition company. And suddenly, everything they thought they controlled was about to backfire. What happens when the tables are turned, and the people who think they're untouchable face someone who can literally destroy what they built?
Before everything went sideways, life in my quiet suburban neighborhood felt perfect, almost too perfect. I had moved in 5 years ago, drawn by the wide streets, manicured lawns, and the kind of neighbors who smiled at each other over morning coffee. My home wasn't just a house, it was our family's sanctuary. Weekends meant barbecues in the backyard, evenings were for watching the sunset over the tree-lined street, and the kids rode their bikes freely without a worry in the world. I prided myself on being an involved, reasonable neighbor, paying my dues on time, volunteering for community events, and even lending a hand when someone needed help. Everything seemed orderly, predictable, until the HOA started flexing its muscles. At first, it was small stuff, a notice about an overgrown hedge, a warning about the color of my mailbox. I brushed it off as typical rule stuff, thinking nothing of it. But I started noticing the subtle ways the HOA and certain neighbors watched everything we did. Lawn hours were scrutinized, trash cans photographed, permits questioned. A quiet sense of unease crept in, like living in a community where every smile hit a clipboard and every nod hid judgment. Then came the day they broke the final line, building 28 condos right on the edge of my property. At first, it felt unreal, almost like a nightmare I could wake up from. But the permits were real, the bulldozers were real, and the people behind it, the HOA board, seemed untouchable. That's when I realized my peaceful life was about to turn into a battle I didn't ask for, but one I couldn't ignore.
It started small, almost laughably petty at first. A letter slipped under my door, neatly stamped with the HOA seal, warning me that my garden gnomes violated community aesthetic standards. Gnomes. Not a fence, not a structure, but gnomes. I laughed, thinking it was some sort of joke, until the fines arrived. $200 for the first warning, escalating quickly if I didn't comply. I paid, shaking my head, convinced that reason would eventually prevail. But reason never came. Soon, the letters weren't about gnomes, they were about the color of my driveway, the precise angle of my mailbox, the length of the grass at the edges of my property. Every day it felt like I was walking a tightrope over a pit of rules I didn't even know existed. I started noticing the HOA patrols in their shiny SUVs, circling like sharks, peering into windows, scrutinizing every movement. Friends began avoiding visits, afraid of becoming collateral in this neighborhood war. Then the threats escalated. One morning, I received a notice that my property was non-compliant with the community zoning code, and that if I didn't correct it within 7 days, they would place a lien on my house. The notice was vague, citing obscure regulations that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I spent hours reading legal documents, trying to understand what I had done wrong, only to realize they were intentionally keeping me confused, playing a game where the rules were constantly changing. At the same time, certain neighbors began to act differently. Smiles that once felt warm now felt calculating. I'd catch whispered conversations behind fences, quick glances as I walked by. Someone reported me for leaving my recycling bin out too long. Another accused me of minor landscaping infractions. Each complaint felt like another brick in the wall they were building around me, isolating me from the community I had once loved. The most shocking turn came when I discovered the condos, 28 units sprouting overnight along the boundary of my property. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I stared from my kitchen window, disbelief anchoring me to the floor. Bulldozers rumbled, foundations poured, and concrete rose while I scrambled to understand the legal nightmare I was suddenly living in. I tried calling the HOA board, pleading for clarification. The secretary's calm, clipped voice on the phone was chilling. All permits are in order. There's nothing more to discuss. Nothing more to discuss. Their calmness was a weapon, a way of telling me they were untouchable. I wasn't going to stand idly by. I began documenting everything, the letters, the fines, the construction, even the snide comments from neighbors who seemed eager to side with the board to protect their own property. I recorded videos, took photos, saved emails. Each piece of evidence was a small lifeline, a way to remind myself that I wasn't crazy and that the rules weren't actually being enforced fairly. They were being weaponized. But the HOA wasn't done. They escalated their harassment in ways that made me question how far people could sink. One night, I found my fence spray painted with warnings, "Property line violation, correct immediately." Another morning, a notice was stapled to my door claiming my family's dog was violating noise ordinances, despite the dog barely barking. I could see the pattern emerging. They weren't interested in rules, they were interested in control. I started attending the HOA board meetings, determined to confront them publicly. Sitting in that windowless room, I realized how calculated the system was. The board had allies in every corner. The accountant who approved every fine, the secretary who filed every complaint, even a few neighbors who seemed eager to throw me under the bus to protect their own property. My protests were met with polite nods and bureaucratic jargon, like I was talking to a wall of smiles hiding sharpened knives. Tensions reached a fever pitch when a letter arrived threatening legal action unless I removed a garden shed they claimed was too close to the property line. This shed had been in my yard for years, unchallenged, until suddenly it became a symbol of rebellion in their eyes. The irony wasn't lost on me. I owned a demolition company. The very tools they assumed were powerless in their hands were mine. But I didn't act immediately. I had to plan. Rushing in would give them leverage, and in a battle like this, leverage was everything. Days blurred into nights as I researched every law, every clause, every loophole. I hired an attorney, not to attack yet, but to arm myself with knowledge. I began talking to sympathetic neighbors, carefully building alliances without revealing my full plan. I knew that this wasn't just about fines or letters anymore. It was about asserting control, making an example, and watching fear ripple through a community that once prided itself on neighborly trust. And then the HOA made the mistake that changed everything. They scheduled a community hearing, intending to publicly shame me in front of the neighborhood, paint me as the villain, and force compliance. Invitations were slipped under doors with ominous language. Attendance required. Failure to appear will result in penalties. I read the notice again, my pulse quickening. This was the stage they had built, expecting me to crumble. But instead I felt a strange mix of dread and determination. What they didn't realize was that every small violation, every petty complaint, every sneering neighbor had prepared me for this moment. I wasn't just fighting for my property. I was fighting for respect, for sanity, and for the principle that no one could manipulate the rules to terrorize a single family. As the day of the hearing approached, I kept a close eye on the condos they had illegally, or at least questionably, built. I could feel the tension in the air, a mix of heat from the summer sun and the cold weight of injustice pressing down on me. My phone buzzed constantly with notices, and yet I remained calm, calculating every move. Because I knew that when the confrontation finally came, it wouldn't just be about fences, permits, or fines. It would be about exposing the audacity of people who thought power could be wielded without consequence. And when I finally made my move, it wouldn't just shock the HOA. It would send a message to the entire neighborhood. The calm before the storm was terrifying but exhilarating. Every petty violation, every hostile glance, every fine had led to this point. I wasn't sure exactly how it would unfold, but I knew one thing: the tables were about to turn in a way no one could have predicted. And then that quiet, tension-filled moment, I asked myself, how far am I willing to go to reclaim what's mine? And will the HOA finally meet someone who isn't afraid to fight back?
The day of the community hearing arrived with a tension that was almost suffocating. The summer sun beat down on the asphalt streets, and the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and fear. I parked my truck at the edge of the HOA clubhouse parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind rehearsing every argument, every piece of evidence I had collected. I could already see the HOA board members clustered together, whispering, smirking, acting as though they were untouchable monarchs overseeing a court of submission. As I walked toward the building, neighbors began to peek from behind curtains, driveways, and porches. I felt their curious eyes, a mixture of fear and anticipation, watching the unfolding drama. The HOA board had clearly orchestrated this moment, intending to humiliate me publicly, to brand me the villain in my own home. But I was ready. Every threat, every petty fine, every underhanded complaint had been leading to this moment. The clubhouse doors opened, and I stepped inside. The room was crowded, a semicircle of chairs filled with residents who had been coerced into attending. The air was thick with tension, the faint hum of whispered conversations underscoring the intensity. The HOA president, a man named Charles Whitmore, stood at the front, a perfectly polished stack of papers in hand. His smile was practiced, a mask of congeniality that barely hid the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Thank you all for attending," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "We're here today to address violations that have been brought to our attention regarding Mr. Harris's property." He gestured toward me, as if I were a specimen on display. "We believe these issues are serious enough to warrant immediate action." The room seemed to shrink around me as the weight of every past harassment pressed down. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady when I replied, "With all due respect, Charles, every claim you've presented is either factually inaccurate, legally dubious, or a direct violation of property rights." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. The board members exchanged glances, subtly conveying their disbelief. This was not the scared homeowner they expected to face. I had come armed with stacks of photographs, video evidence, and legal documents that meticulously disproved every claim they had ever made. I wasn't here to argue politely. I was here to dismantle their power publicly, piece by piece. Charles cleared his throat and began reading from the first notice, the infamous driveway color violation. As he spoke, I interjected, calmly and deliberately. According to Section 4.2 of the HOA's own code, the driveway guidelines only apply to new installations. Mine has been here for over 8 years, fully compliant under the rules in effect at the time. You are attempting to retroactively enforce rules that do not apply. The room fell silent. I could feel the tension spike as board members shifted uncomfortably. Charles attempted to regain control, but I continued, presenting evidence of past approvals, photographs and emails from the HOA's secretary that had previously acknowledged the driveway as compliant. Every word, every document chipped away at the illusion of their authority. Then came the moment that would tip the scales entirely. I stood and pulled out the site plan for the 28 condos built along my property line. The room collectively leaned in. "These units," I said, voice steady but charged with anger, were constructed in direct violation of zoning laws and property boundaries. The permits you claim to have are incomplete, improperly filed, and in several cases, falsified. This is not a suggestion, it is a documented legal breach." Gasps filled the room. A few residents whispered to one another, shock written on their faces. I could see the color draining from Charles's face. He tried to interject, but I held up a hand, letting the weight of the evidence speak. "I have consulted with my attorney, confirmed with city zoning officials, and retained structural reports proving these condos encroach onto my property by several feet. Every action taken by the HOA here today, every fine, every threat is null and void under law. It was at this moment that the dynamics shifted completely. The smug arrogance that had fueled the HOA's harassment began to crack. Board members whispered frantically, passing papers back and forth, desperate to find a way to regain authority. The residents, who had once been pawns or silent observers, now looked at me with a mixture of awe and relief. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was showing them the cost of unchecked power. The meeting grew more intense as I presented the final piece of evidence, a video recording of a board member instructing a contractor to make it difficult for Harris and to ignore regulations if necessary. The camera angles, timestamps, and audio clarity left no room for denial. The room went dead silent. Charles's jaw tightened, and he sank slightly in his chair. For the first time, he was cornered, exposed in front of the very people he had sought to intimidate. I took a deep breath and let the silence stretch. "This," I said, letting my gaze sweep across the entire room, "is what happens when those entrusted with authority abuse it. I am not asking for leniency. I am demanding accountability. The violations you claim, the fines you have imposed, the harassment you have conducted, all of it will be addressed through legal channels if it continues." Some board members began to protest, but the tension had shifted so dramatically that their objections sounded hollow. One resident even stood and muttered, "Finally, someone speaks the truth." Others nodded, some quietly clapping, while a few still avoided eye contact, shame washing over their faces. It was in that moment that I felt the tide turn, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. The power imbalance that had been carefully cultivated by the HOA began to crumble. The smug certainty, the orchestrated intimidation, the daily harassment, it all faltered under the weight of evidence, preparation, and unwavering conviction. I didn't need to act physically. I didn't need to demonstrate the tools of my demolition company. My preparation, patience, and refusal to be intimidated became the weapon that dismantled their authority. Charles tried to salvage the meeting, his voice rising in desperation, but it was too late. Every resident had seen the cracks, and the fear that had kept them compliant evaporated in real time. The HOA attempted one last maneuver, threatening legal escalation, fines, and liens, but my attorney, who had quietly entered the room, stepped forward and confirmed every claim with authority. The weight of legal truth crushed any remaining pretense. Finally, Charles slumped back, his expression a mixture of disbelief, anger, and resignation. The room exhaled collectively, tension dissipating like steam from a pressure cooker. But the climax wasn't just about exposing them. It was about reclaiming control. I walked to the window overlooking the condos and gestured toward them. These structures were built to intimidate, but the people who thought they could enforce fear on others have underestimated one thing: resolve. And the consequences for abusing power are coming. As I left the clubhouse that day, I could feel the neighborhood shift subtly around me. Smiles were warmer, eyes less cautious, whispers more honest. I had not only defended my property, but I had also demonstrated that courage, preparation, and unwavering conviction can topple even the most entrenched systems of control. And yet, as I walked back to my truck, a quiet question lingered in my mind, echoing the tension that had brought us to this moment. The HOA board had been exposed, humiliated, and restrained. The tension that had gripped my neighborhood for months slowly began to dissipate after the confrontation at the HOA hearing. The board, once untouchable in their smug authority, had been publicly exposed for their abuse of power, and the repercussions rippled through every corner of the community. But the victory wasn't instantaneous. There were still details to untangle, repairs to make, and trust to rebuild. First, the legal implications of the HOA's actions had to be addressed. I worked closely with my attorney to ensure that every improper fine, every harassment notice, and every attempted lien was officially nullified. Letters were sent, confirming that the HOA's prior actions had no legal basis, and that any future attempts to enforce those fabricated rules would be met with swift legal response. For the first time in months, I felt a deep sense of relief, not just for myself, but for the principle at stake. The neighborhood had seen firsthand that no organization, no matter how entrenched, was above accountability. The 28 condos that had been built along my property line became the central symbol of the HOA's overreach. City inspectors were brought in to evaluate the construction, and it was confirmed that several units violated zoning laws, encroached onto my property, and had been built without proper permits. The HOA board had clearly hoped that once the concrete was poured, no one would challenge them, but their arrogance had blinded them to one key factor: evidence and preparation are more powerful than intimidation. Orders were issued for the structures to be removed or modified to comply with regulations. Watching the bulldozers, this time under lawful authority and my supervision, dismantle the illegally built units was oddly satisfying. Each beam that fell felt like a metaphorical blow to the culture of fear the board had tried to cultivate. But legal victories and structural corrections were only part of the resolution. The social fabric of the neighborhood had been strained almost beyond repair, and rebuilding trust was a delicate process. Some neighbors who had quietly supported the board out of fear approached me afterward, embarrassed and apologetic. Others had observed silently, wondering if they had aligned themselves with the wrong side of the conflict. Slowly, through conversations, shared understanding, and small acts of goodwill, the community began to shift. People realized that standing up to abusive power didn't mean confrontation. It meant courage, persistence, and clarity. Interestingly, the board members themselves faced consequences that extended beyond legal and structural corrections. Several were voted out during the next HOA election, their credibility shattered by the evidence presented at the hearing. A few resigned in quiet shame, unwilling to face public scrutiny any longer. Those who remained had to adopt a much more transparent, accountable approach, understanding that their previous tactics of intimidation would no longer be tolerated. The balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of fairness and reason, and the neighborhood felt the change immediately. For my family, life began to regain a sense of normalcy. The backyard barbecues returned, but now with an added sense of ownership and security. My children could play freely again, riding their bikes without a shadow of fear or anxiety about petty complaints or neighborhood surveillance. The garden gnomes made their triumphant return to their usual spots, a small but satisfying reminder that absurd restrictions had no place in a community built on trust and mutual respect. Even the mailbox, driveway, and landscaping, all previously scrutinized, stood proudly, free from the oppressive gaze of arbitrary rules.
There was also a sense of empowerment for those who had felt voiceless. Witnessing the unraveling of the board's authority showed that systems of power can be challenged, and that doing so responsibly and strategically can bring meaningful change. Several neighbors, inspired by the outcome, began documenting their own interactions with the HOA, ensuring that the mistakes and abuses of the past would not be repeated. What had started as a personal struggle against harassment became a broader lesson in vigilance, civic responsibility, and the importance of standing up for fairness. Of course, the resolution didn't mean the end of all challenges. There were still minor disputes to address, follow-up inspections to coordinate, and occasional awkward interactions with former board members. But the fear and uncertainty that had dominated my life for months had been replaced by confidence and a sense of control. I realized that victory isn't just about winning a single battle. It's about reclaiming agency over one's life and environment, and using that agency to ensure justice and fairness endure. The impact extended even further when I shared my story publicly. I documented the entire journey, the petty harassment, the escalating intimidation, the strategic preparation, and the ultimate confrontation. The story resonated with homeowners across the country, many of whom faced similar struggles. Comments flooded in from people who felt powerless against their own neighborhood associations, thanking me for demonstrating that abuse of power could be confronted successfully. My experience became a blueprint for resisting oppression in local governance structures, showing that preparation, documentation, and persistence are the most effective tools against intimidation. And yet, beyond the legal victories, community reforms, and public recognition, the most profound impact was personal. I discovered a depth of resilience I hadn't known I possessed, a capacity to remain calm under pressure while strategically dismantling obstacles, and the clarity to differentiate between fear and reason. The ordeal strengthened not only my resolve, but also my belief in fairness, justice, and the power of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. As the dust settled, I often found myself standing at the edge of my property, looking at the now empty space where the condos had briefly loomed like a symbol of tyranny. The sight reminded me that systems of intimidation may rise, but they can be dismantled when confronted with courage, preparation, and principle. It also reminded me that vigilance is necessary. Abuse of power never sleeps, and the responsibility to uphold fairness is ongoing. Reflecting on the journey, one truth became abundantly clear. No law, rule, or authority should ever be used to intimidate or control people unfairly. Authority only has value when wielded with accountability and transparency, and communities thrive when members feel respected and heard. My fight against the HOA wasn't just a battle for property. It was a battle for integrity, justice, and the reminder that even small voices can stand up against overwhelming odds and prevail. As the neighborhood slowly returned to its rhythm, life felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because the simple joys, sunsets, laughter, barbecues, and quiet mornings were restored. Extraordinary because the scars of confrontation and the lessons learned infused a new depth of understanding and appreciation. The fight had changed the neighborhood, the board, the residents, and me. And perhaps, most importantly, it had proven that courage, strategy, and steadfast resolve can transform a seemingly hopeless struggle into a legacy of justice and empowerment. In the end, I couldn't help but wonder about the future. Would the HOA ever test the boundaries of power again? Perhaps. But now, the neighborhood and I were ready. We had witnessed the consequences of arrogance and unchecked authority, and we had learned in the most visceral way possible that standing up for what is right, even in the face of fear and intimidation, is always worth it. So, as I look back on the months of tension, fear, and eventual triumph, one lesson stands out above all. When faced with injustice, preparation, persistence, and courage aren't just tools, they're weapons. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't just to defend what's yours, but to show the world that fairness and accountability can prevail, even in the most unlikely of battles.